Woodson made it to the beach alive, just barely. As the boat carrying Woodson and the medics approached Omaha Beach, all eyes were on the water. Around them, men bobbed in a sea made red by their own blood. Those still alive waited to be pulled from the drink by boats that might never come. The skippers of the landing craft had been ordered to ignore their cries for help, and men in motor launches with megaphones dissuaded those with second thoughts. "You are not a rescue ship," hollered one of them. "Get on shore." First, Woodson's craft hit a mine, which blew out the motor. Then another blast exploded the right side, felling troops like matchsticks. The heavy fire kept coming. The LCT's 40-millimeter guns, which had been blazing moments earlier, now lay silent. The bodies of their gunners hung lifeless as if from a gruesome clothesline. A shell landed on the hood of a Jeep, incinerating the 4 men inside. Woodson crouched beside a truck filled with medical supplies. A soldier beside him was hit and killed. Woodson's lower extremities burned. He reached down and brought up a hand covered in blood. "I am dying," he thought. One of the medics slapped dressings on his buttocks and inner thigh, ripped open by shrapnel. "Close," Woodson would say later. "Mighty close." The medics tended to the few men still living. The helpless craft drifted to a stop. The ramp fell with a bang, and to Woodson's surprise, the tank came alive. It rolled down the ramp onto the beach and turned right. The men followed it, splashing down in 4 feet of water. Woodson and medics Eugene Worthy and Alfred Bell, both from Memphis, hit the beach and ran, slugs popping mini geysers of sand at their feet. Woodson looked back and saw the trunk's turret in flames. No men were coming out. It was 9 a.m. In the shelter of the shingle, Woodson unpacked a tent roll he had pulled out of the water. Now there was a medical station. The rising tide carried in the dead and threatened to drown the living. Under constant fire, the medics dragged the wounded and the dead out of the shooting gallery at the water's edge. Their Red Cross brassards made them easy targets for German snipers hiding in the bluffs, who ignored the rules of war and fired on many medics that day. There were too many men who needed saving. Their cries for help would haunt Woodson. On Omaha, war was a great equalizer. At that time, Woodson would say later, they didn't care what color my skin was. Throughout the day and night and into the next day, Woodson worked through his pain to save lives. He pulled out bullets, patched gaping wounds, and dispensed blood plasma. He amputated a right foot. When he thought he could do no more, he resuscitated 4 drowning men. 30 hours after he set his boots on Omaha Beach, Woody Woodson collapsed. There is a sole piece of paper in the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, that proves that Waverly Woodson was nominated for the Medal of Honor. It is a handwritten note from an aide in the War Department to an aide in the White House that says a Negro from Philadelphia was nominated for a suitable award, underlined, and that U.S. General John Lee in Britain upgraded that recommendation to the Medal of Honor. There is no trace today of the records that explain Waverly Woodson's medals. It's a common story. Only 1% of Army records from World War II exist today. And a fire in the Army's archives in St. Louis, Missouri in 1973 destroyed 80% of personnel records. What we know is that Woodson got a Purple Heart for his injuries and belatedly a Bronze Star for his service on Omaha Beach. To the Army, the note in the Truman Library is hearsay, but there is further proof of Woodson's actions in Normandy. In the summer of 1944, Waverly Woodson was a huge star. The crusading press hailed him as #1 invasion hero. White newspapermen came to interview him. Stars and Stripes wrote that Woodson and the medics were covered with glory on D-Day. Woodson returned home a celebrity, and the accolades continued. He was invited to recount his heroics on a nationwide radio show, and the black press began calling on the White House to award him the Medal of Honor. Significantly, stapled to the note in the Truman Library is a press release issued by the Army on August 28, 1944, detailing Woodson's heroism. That the Army would praise the individual actions of a black man on Omaha Beach was nothing short of extraordinary. There is a white soldier who did receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 6th, actions remarkably similar to Woodson's, except he was not injured. I detail what he did in Chapter 9 of my book. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the French government chose a trio of Americans to honor. They flew them to France and presented them with a palm-sized medal commemorating their service in Normandy. I was the only black man of the three, Woodson said proudly. He was 72 years old, and this is about the time of that medal with Waverly and his wife, Joanne. Woodson died on August 12, 2005. His grave is at Arlington National Cemetery, where America buries its heroes. Every Memorial Day, Joanne visits his white marble grave with an armful of her husband's favorite red roses. Last June, President Obama awarded the Medal of Honor to a black soldier from World War I named Henry Johnson. This is Henry Johnson wearing his French Croix de Guerre medal. Sergeant Johnson was a member of the legendary Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry from New York. And in the color line exhibit, you can see an unbelievable film of them playing their instruments because they were all accomplished musicians and band leaders from Harlem. And you can see them playing their instruments and marching through the streets. It is said that they introduced jazz to France by playing the Marseillaise and the Tuileries for the first time to a jazzy beat. It's really extraordinary. The caption doesn't even tell you that, but that's the story when you see it. The World War I room is fantastic. Anyway, Sergeant Johnson single-handedly fought off a German raiding party that attacked the trench he was guarding, using up all of his weapons until all he had left was his bolo knife. His story is detailed in Chapter 2 of the book. Like Woodson, Johnson was a star. He made headlines from coast to coast. What most of those readers perhaps did not know was that Johnson and his regiment were given over to French command by the American General John J. Pershing, who didn't want Negroes in his army. The Hellfighters fought in French uniforms alongside French poilus and received French medals for their extraordinary record. They served more days on the front lines than any other American unit. The French called them the Men of Bronze. The Germans called them the Hellfighters for their ferocity in battle. Johnson died 11 years after the war in poverty, without even a Purple Heart for his injuries, and therefore no medical benefits to treat his very serious wartime injuries. In a ceremony at the White House, the president said, "It is never too late to say thank you." There is a campaign underway to persuade the powers that be in Washington to award the Medal of Honor to Waverly Woodson, led by his family in the office of Maryland Congressman Chris Van Hollen. The homepage on my website, which is myname.com, links to the petition. If you agree that the case has been made to award Woodson the medal, please consider adding your name to it. It takes about a minute. In 1941, when the men of the 320th began receiving their draft notices, the Army was a bastion of racism. Its ranks were dominated by Southern commanders who determined that Southern officers like them were the best suited to handle black men. This is a photo of the 320th in France in the summer of 1944. How bad was it? Well, to understand the world these men were thrust into, it's necessary to understand that Army policy at the time was a lesson in what happens when racism meets pseudoscience. The science at the time held that black brains were smaller than white brains, and sometimes hat size was used to measure this difference. An Army War College study from 1925, still on the books, was indicative of the type of thinking that underpinned Army policy. And I'll read you a little bit of it because it seems like it can't possibly be true that in 1940 this was still something that was believed, but it was, and you see it quoted not just in this form, but in various forms in the Army documents throughout this period. The Negro is profoundly superstitious. He is by nature subservient and naturally believes himself inferior to the white. He is jolly, tractable, lively, and docile, but through real or supposed harsh or unjust treatment may become sullen and stubborn. He has not the physical courage of the white. He simply cannot control himself in fear of some danger in the degree that the white man can. His psychology is such that he willingly accepts hard labor and for this reason can well be employed in labor troops or other non-combatant branches. The Negro is unmoral. He simply does not see certain things as wrong. The Negro is one of the most secretive in the world. While the Negro undoubtedly has a state of mind bordering on resentment against the white, this feeling is numbed by his easygoing nature. The Negro's growing sense of importance will make them more and more of a problem, and racial problems may well be expected to increase. That part was certainly true. Anger in Black America toward treatment of their men in uniform was rising and would be blamed in part for sparking more than 200 race riots that would rock America in 1943. One of the men who got one of those draft notices in June 1941 was a 21-year-old in Atlantic City named Wilson Caldwell Monk. For Monk, being drafted meant a steady paycheck. The $30 he would earn monthly in the Army was a measure of security he very much needed. In Atlantic City, the country's first planned resort town, there were 3 months to earn your money by stringing together as many jobs as you could before Labor Day, when the curtain fell and Atlantic City shut up tight. The odds of getting a decent job in the long, cold winter were slight. At that time, America was not at war, so Wilson Monk expected a one-year commitment. He was in for a surprise, and an even bigger surprise when he boarded a train and headed south for his first Army training camp. Somewhere north of Washington, D.C., Monk was told he had to switch to the Negro car. He had no idea what that meant. The Negro car was always hard by the noisy, dirty coal engine, so a soldier in uniform would arrive wherever he was going covered in black soot. The train south was the first taste of Jim Crow for the North's black recruits, who would arrive at their first destination of boot camp already fuming. Jim Crow, as most of you know, was a series of laws in the southern United States that ensured the separation of the races. What you might not know is they included such crimes as pretending to be a white man. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws spread across the South like a poisonous weed, so that by 1890, the races were effectively separate, and black men and women had to step off sidewalks and avert their eyes when passing whites. At an army base in Pennsylvania, the black troops were warned that any contact with a white woman, whether voluntary or not, would be considered rape, and the penalty, death.